Good afternoon. I am Leslie Van Zandt, Chief Advancement Officer here at WAMU. If you are just joining us, welcome. If you are returning after our short break from the panel discussion, welcome back. But to all, thank you so much for joining us at the Diane Rehm Book Club. At WAMU, we strive to connect our listeners and members to the world through thought-provoking programming. And we hope that this conversation today encourages exploration and celebration of diverse stories and people and perspectives. Some housekeeping for today's edition of the Diane Rehm Book Club. Please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen to interact with each other and our book club producer, Allison Brody. Also, today's event will be closed captioned. Just click the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to engage with this. Diane's conversation with the Covenant of Water author Abraham Verghese will surely offer insight into this incredible story. This book club is made possible through the generosity of WAMU members and listeners like you. If you enjoy today's event, please consider making a gift in support. You can donate at dianerehm.org/give. And now, without further pause, it is my great pleasure to introduce our hostess, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Leslie, and welcome all to the Diane Rehm Club. I'm thrilled to be joined by Abraham Verghese, author of The Covenant of Water. I first met Dr. Verghese in 2009 when I interviewed him about his first novel, Cutting for Stone. Now, after 14 years comes his second, The Covenant of Water. It tells the story of 3 generations of a family in Kerala, India. The book became an instant bestseller, and it is simply beautiful. Verghese is also a practicing physician and professor of medicine at Stanford University. In other words, he is a very busy man, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to talk with him today. If you have questions for Dr. Verghese, type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to just as many as we can. And Dr. Verghese, it's so good to have you with us. I'm just delighted to see you again.
Likewise, a great pleasure for me too, Diane. Thank you.
Thank you. So many people have asked us to ask you whether this story has come from your own background, your own life, characters you may have known, and a condition you might have heard of.
Well, so the story did come from my background in that, I hail from a community in South India that is in Kerala that is predominantly Christian. I think it's a fascinating, somewhat insular community that intermarries and has very particular rituals. So I chose that background. And I was also inspired by a manuscript that my mother prepared for her 5-year-old, my 5-year-old niece, her granddaughter, in which she wrote all about her childhood and anecdotes and rituals of the kitchen. And I never wound up using very many of those or any of those, but it was a reminder of how rich that family environment, and especially the heroic maternal figures of my grandmother and great-grandmother, how powerful characters like that could be. And so that's what I drew upon. I don't really think I used any actual characters other than famous historical ones that are, well known.
When did you begin reading your mother's stories?
So my mother had retired after a long career, and my mother was a pretty incredible woman. If you can imagine a a single woman in India graduating in physics with a college degree, just as, as Britain is leaving India after centuries of colonization, and there were no jobs to be had. And my mom saw this ad for a teaching position in Ethiopia. And, picture a single woman in a sari going on a steamship or however she went to Aden and then to Ethiopia. And she had an illustrious, long career there. Then she came to America well before I did, and taught in New Jersey and retired in Florida. And in her 70s is when she wrote that.
That's when she began writing that in her
And she wrote
70s.
it longhand in a school book and illustrated it. And so we were all very aware of it. And, it was a bit of a family treasure. But I sort of came back to it when I was done with Cutting for Stone and looking for something else. And Mom was incredibly excited when I said I wanted to set a novel there. She became my #1 researcher. She died at 93. She didn't get to see the book completed, but even in the last month of her life, she would call me up to tell me an anecdote that she'd remembered, and I didn't have the heart to tell her that she mentioned the same anecdote the previous day. But I sense that she's up there watching and is, behind a lot of the success of the book.
And indeed, you were watching our last hour when we had a discussion among 3 people who were so interested in your book and talking about the various characters. What was that like for you, hearing them talk about it?
Actually, it was pretty awesome because I try to come to as many book clubs as invite me, but that's become quite formidable now, as you can imagine.
Yes.
Because when you're a writer, you're writing in such isolation. I'm writing from this very spot is where I write. And, you're trying to imagine the moment when a reader picks up the book. And so book clubs are very special, except I can't quite be a fly on the wall. The moment I show up, I alter the experiment quite significantly. But your panel was extraordinary because it really was the first time that I've been able to sit back quietly and listen to 3 people I greatly respect, a writer, a literary person, a physician involved in humanities, talk about my book. So tremendously edifying and humbling. It was really great.
I'm so glad. I did not tell them that you'd be watching because I feared that that might somehow inhibit or change any comment they might make. So I thought it better just to leave that out. But what does it feel like having gotten this incredible reception for this book? It's been on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while now. But in addition to that, when I talk with people about the book, they are just overcome with its intricacy, its information, the covenant, the meaning of the covenant, which I just found extraordinary. I mean, what does it feel for you to have such a huge and widely read book?
It's felt like a miracle. It feels like, the most incredible summer of my life, barring the birth of my children. I don't think there's anything that's happened to me that's been quite as profound. And, partly because I don't have I don't think I can say that I anticipated this effect or that I can even claim it, because I have this theory that the writer provides the words, the reader provides their imagination, and you never know how it's going to take shape in each reader's mind, and it's unique to each reader. But the fact that these common, responses are resonating and that they're spreading is huge. It's just very, very humbling. But I must say that, it is a big book. It took wonderful endorsements like you picking it for your book club, Miss Winfrey picking it for her book club. These are the wonderful ways that, the public is invited to take on a book that maybe would have been a hard sell otherwise. The other thing is that I went through a lot with this book. I mean, I had to change publishers mid-course because my previous editor and I didn't quite agree on the shape of this, and it was a very scary thing to do, great financial peril that I'm not entirely out of. But I really felt that it would be tragic to spend so much time on this book and not have it represent what I wanted to say. I was very, very fortunate to find a brilliant editor in Peter Blackstock at Grove Atlantic, a wonderful company. And so it feels like very, very sweet vindication, Diane, to have had it go so low and now to be, so gloriously received. I'm just humbled. I'm in awe.
I'm sure part of the reason it took so long to write this was the changing of the publisher and so on. But what else kept you going through that period that that had to have been so difficult for you to write?
Well, I think I have to not put all the blame on anyone else. I'm a slow writer, so I tend to write, while holding a day job that can be pretty busy at times. And and I also am not one of these writers who knows the whole story. I really begin with a voice. I begin with one character who allows me to enter the story, and then I wind up, taking these long detours, and many of them are, after many months and hundreds of pages, I realize are not going anywhere, or else they don't serve the story. And so then you come back. So at least for me, I wish there was a simpler way. On my right side, you can sort of see a big whiteboard, which has
I see it.
the outline, the outline of the book. But the trouble is, I have changed this whiteboard so many times to catch up with my narrative, which was now going in a different way. So, my thesis is that writing is utterly mysterious, that, you sit yourself down and God knows what, the right brain, the muse, the characters themselves begin to speak to you, and then you try to honor them. And that seems to be what happened.
Who was the character you began with?
The young bride, Big Amachi, who in many ways was echoing, characters that people in my life would influence me. Both my grandmothers were extraordinary heroic figures, but unheralded. The world will never know about their heroism, their ability to withstand tragedy, their incredible values and faith that kept them going when anybody else might have given up. And both of them were married very young, but also to very young boys, essentially, and they just become part of a household, one of the children, and their mother-in-law becomes someone even closer to them than their mother, because this is the person that they know from the age of 10, 11, 12. And on the book tour, I ran into a family member who showed me an album, and she pointed to someone and said, she was married very young, and she went to her mother-in-law and sat in her lap because she loved her and said, Amachi, that boy over there, the one sitting there with the other boys, can we get rid of him? He's so annoying. And that was her husband. And they went on to have a glorious marriage. So I began with that little girl and trying to put myself in their shoes. And
wow.
The marriage to an older widower is the real story of my great-grandmother.
Oh, I see.
But she married a widower who already had children. And on paper, it would have seemed such an inauspicious type of marriage. But it went on to be a glorious marriage. She had more children. And because he was older, she outlived him. But everybody spoke of her with such reverence. And so I think an amalgamation of all these things is where I began, with a strong woman. I felt like that was who would be the main character in the book.
And a number of people have asked whether there really is this kind of problem with water that exists. I know in the book, Mariama, finally, as she becomes a doctor, finds something behind the ear bone that does affect balance, and certainly affects, I would gather, the ability to swim. So is that the reality of this curse, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a longtime teacher of medicine, I always keep in my back pocket, a number of rare and exotic diseases. And when there's a lull in the conversation around the bedside or with the residents in the hallway, I will ask them a riddle or ask them a question, and so this is one rare condition that I knew about and had tucked away. And when I was putting the novel together, at some point, it just seemed like, given the prevalence of water as a metaphor for the state, and also in the book, it just seemed like the most, the most difficult condition to weather in a situation like that is where you can't get into water, and so it is a real condition. I think I took it and ran with it. It's by no means as common as I lay out in the book, but it certainly is very real. And I also like the fact that it echoes my own life in medicine. I mean, there were so many things as a medical student that were undescribed, or it was not known what caused this phenomenon. And then as the decades have gone on, we have the biology, the molecular basis of the disease explained, and then it turns out to be 3 or 4 or 5 diseases. We have therapy. So I loved writing something epic and long enough that during the lifetime of the novel, so to speak, you would see what was considered a curse or a condition,
Yes,
become, beautifully defined.
and wasn't epilepsy one of those diseases early
Absolutely.
on?
Yeah, leprosy too, many, many examples of diseases that were metaphors for, the devil, for this, for that, but there was
Yes.
a biological basis.
A question from one of our listeners. First, he says, many congratulations on yet another absorbing, epic, and beautiful novel. This book had so much sadness. The reader is taken on so many emotional roller coasters. Is it emotionally draining for you to weave so many heartbreaking narratives?
Yeah, it was actually, there were moments when I suddenly realized that this character or that character was going to pass away, and in this fashion. And then every time I would revise it, I would be in tears. And when I recorded the audiobook, there was a point, and mind you, I've seen that revision hundreds of times, but as we're recording, there was a point where the producer, the tech, and myself were all reaching for tissues. We had to stop, because it is, these are people I cared about. And but I will say that, people have said that there's so much tragedy in your book. I think it was reflective of the times. My grandmother on one side lost her only son. She had 3 daughters and a son, and she lost her only son at the age of 12 to typhoid fever. And my mother still remembers that vividly. On my father's side, he remembers losing his older brother when he was a little boy. The oldest brother was bitten by a dog that he was fending off from attacking the other children. And a month later, he had all the classic symptoms of rabies and died the most gruesome death. So these are real things that both my grandmothers witnessed. There was a lot of morbidity that was just true to the times. And I think as a physician, I'm much more attuned to the fact that, life is precious and poignant because it can end suddenly, and because it ends inevitably for all of us. I mean, life is a terminal condition, but there are many, many examples that I see of all of us being surprised by, by our good health being derailed in some fashion. So I don't think that's excessive. It's probably more real than people realize.
Also educational to understand, for example, that leprosy is not a contagious disease.
Not very contagious. I mean, technically it is contagious. You probably are getting it from another patient, and clearly proximity to a patient has some risk, but your genetic susceptibility has a lot to do with it, the cleanliness of the environment. We're still seeing, we're not seeing anywhere as much leprosy as I commonly saw as a child in the streets, and certainly in medical school in Africa and India. That's become much more uncommon. but we're still diagnosing leprosy. I diagnosed a case in Texas, and there are descriptions of other cases in Florida. Some of them are not even people coming from elsewhere. They're homegrown. So it still happens, but it's certainly not as common.
There is one situation where Digby sees a man who has a hole for a nose, and you explain how that man's nose was replaced with flesh from his forehead and breathes through the nose without any real structure behind it.
Yeah. It's, believe it or not, this is a true story. It was a common way of disfiguring your enemies, was to cut off their nose. And for some reason, bricklayers in India had picked up this ancient, probably pre-Christ technique from one of the surgical, there were one of the fathers of surgery said to be a man by the name of Sushruta. And, they practiced this technique of taking a flap and rotating it and covering the defect and putting in eucalyptus sticks to fashion nostrils so that it didn't close down. And it's remarkable how they did all this before anesthesia, before any of the things we take for granted.
And when Digby loses in fire the use of one of his surgical hands, flesh is taken from his chest to repair the tissue on his hand.
And we still do that. I mean, I actually had the benefit of a wonderful head of plastic surgery here at Stanford, who head of hand surgery, who, sharing with me pictures of pretty much the same thing being done to this day. So these are advanced techniques now, but they originated many centuries ago, believe it or not.
I should tell our audience that after you came onto my program, the Diane Rehm Show, back in 2009, you invited me to Texas to speak to the medical faculty there at the university about my experience with spasmodic dysphonia. I wonder if you've ever come upon any other means for curing or helping that problem other than what I do, which is twice a year injections of Botox into my vocal cords.
Yeah, it's a condition that I have a great deal of empathy for, because one of my family members also suffers with it, and
Really?
it's a difficult condition. I think they get past it by deliberately raising the pitch of their voice, which helps them overcome whatever they're going through. But goodness, I mean, I remember learning a lot from reading your book, and it's not something I deal with. It goes straight to I suppose the ENT folks or whoever does this. But I certainly am more aware of it than most physicians, I think, because of because I've seen it in my own family.
Interesting. And raising the pitch of his or her voice has helped.
Helps them articulate more clearly than when their normal pitch, which sounds very, very hoarse otherwise. So
yes, and deep.
Yeah.
And deep. Here is another question. Our listener says, I'm curious about the experience of reading for the audiobook. Were there moments when you wanted to go back and edit the wording or even direction of the story?
Yeah, it really was an interesting experience. I think in general, it's a red flag when authors read their own books, especially fiction. I mean, because I think that the best audiobooks are being performed by wonderful people. I mean, you can hear Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep performing some of the best audiobooks.
Yes.
But I wanted to audition to record my own book because of the many ethnic terms and names. I just didn't want to be subjected to hearing them butchered, you know.
Yes.
But I also recognize that one has to perform the book. So I auditioned, and I was fortunate to be selected, and I had wonderful coaches in terms of the producer and the studio tech, and they were very, very well versed in this. For example, things like pitching your voice slightly differently in a dialogue with 2 or 3 people to indicate the gender of the speaker, and then, but not overdoing it, but then also picking up accents like the Digby's Glasgow accent, and you know, a upper crust British accent, and all the various regional accents of India. Again, doing them enough, but not exaggerating them. So it was a real education for me. And I must confess that when I finally heard the edited version, I didn't like it, because we're simply not used to hearing our voices outside of our own skull box, you know, our resonance of the skull. And so it was very gratifying to find that the Audible book really was #1 for a long time, and it's still very much up there being downloaded. So that is immensely gratifying. And you know, I listened to a lot of.
I think people loved hearing your voice,
Which was surprising to me.
yeah,
I'm
and
happy.
pronunciation. The second time I read the book, I had my cell phone at my side, going to Google for each word that I did not understand and wanted a pronunciation of. And so it took me longer the second time to read it than even the first. I want to ask you about religion, because practically everyone in this book is Christian, and the area was founded by followers of St. Thomas, who came to the area we are in and maintained that sense of Christianity. How widespread is that now in India? And how widespread was it then?
You know, by Indian standards, given the sizes of the Indian population, it's a very small religion compared to Hinduism, you know, Muslims, Buddhism. But in that part of central Kerala, it's a very prevalent religion. And, you know, it's certainly a bigger population now. Many of them are spread around the world. But it's a fairly small insular community. And by and large, at least a generation or two ago, they would intermarry, you know, looking for people from the same religion, with the opportunity to magnify some of the rare diseases that we see. But people often think that, or wonder if I'm, you know, proselytizing, or if I'm you know, if I'm sort of a Christian zealot. But I was really being true to the times, and being true to the kinds of characters who I met in my parents' and my grandparents' generation. So one of the things that strikes me about my parents' and my grandparents' Christianity is, unlike us, you know, sort of postmodern questioning everything. And this was true of my Hindu friends as well. For them, you know, religion and God was just very much part of their day-to-day fabric. You know, just like you brush your teeth, you stop and pray in front of the gods and light your candles before you head out. And you know, I admired that. I wasn't always able to embrace it in the same way myself, but I was always envious and in awe of, you know, how steeped in that faith people were. My father is 96 now, and my mom and dad used to live here in Palo Alto. They live with my older brother in Boston. My dad still watches the church service online in the church where he was an altar boy, where his father was a deacon, where his parents are buried, his brother is buried. And I recently went to a church in Fremont where there's enough of us here that they had a service in Malayalam and in Syriac, this ancient language. And I never understood Syriac then or now, but I got goosebumps, damn, just listening to it, because I was sort of feeling the ritual and the faith of my ancestors, and it just was pretty powerful, you know.
So to what extent do you consider yourself to be a practicing Christian?
I'm not sure what you mean by the word practicing. I'm not a regular churchgoer, but I'm very much a believer in God and embracing, you know, the faith that I was brought up in, you know, perhaps not to the degree of that my parents or grandparents might, but, you know, I think the very nature of faith is belief in the absence of proof. And I think it's comforting, whatever else you have to say about it. It's a comforting way of going through the world.
And how does that blend with your belief in and practice in science?
Well, I don't think it's a contradiction. You know, I don't really espouse the faith in a very, you know, flashy way or try to impose it on anybody. And you know, like I'm told that there are, you know, surgeons who like to pray with their patients before they do surgery and so on. It's a very delicate thing because at that moment there's a power imbalance. The surgeon is standing over you and saying, well, may I have a prayer with you? Well, what are you to say? If you say, no, thank you, I'm an atheist, you know. So I think that on the other hand, I find that when patients come with a strong faith and they're dealing with great adversity, it's good for them, because then they have something to fall back on. They have sort of a helper in the game, so to speak, compared to its complete absence. So I think that, you know, our personal faith should stay separate from the way we care for patients, but it's always gratifying to see people of any faith use that faith as a partner in their healing, in their recovery, or in their coping with something that they can't recover from.
Indeed. My husband is a hospice chaplain dealing with patients at the end of life. And I think there is a gratitude perhaps exhibited as much or more by the family than the patient, him or herself.
Yeah, I mean, if I may add one more thing to that, you know, the old term for what we do as physicians is, it was the ministry of healing. And, you know, I think there clearly is a component of, you know, coming into the room and, you know, doing your best to help everyone cope with that situation. And I actually learned something very powerful from one of our hospital chaplains who happens to be a rabbi. He wrote a piece about how before he walks into the room, as he washes his hands, as we all do, entering this isolation room or whatever room, he uses that moment to remind himself that he's entering sacred space. And I just love that. And I try to do that. I try to, as I'm washing my hands, I try to make sure none of the baggage from the corridor that I'm carrying or the previous patient or anything is going to come into the room with me, you know, that I can give them my best at that moment.
So what would you say your portrayal of religion and religious belief is? What are you saying to readers? I mean, the word covenant I think of far more in religious terms than in legal terms.
Yeah.
So it told me immediately that the book was going to have religious belief within it. What are you trying to convey with that?
Well, with the title, I have this theory that titles should be somewhat mysterious, that ideally you have a title that at a certain point in the book, the reader says, oh, wow, you know, I think I know what the title means. Cutting for Stone was a good example. And hopefully it resonates at many different levels. But in a way, I don't have the key to the title. As I said, I think that the writer provides the words, the reader provides their imagination, makes the story. But to me, what I was hoping to convey, first of all, I love that word covenant. It has
beautiful.
Has a wonderful Old Testament ring to it. But secondly, I mean, I think there are many covenants in the book. The most relevant one to me is, as a physician, I have a fiduciary responsibility to my patients. I have a covenant. If you come to me, then there's a covenant that, you know, keeps your conversation confidential. And, there's just something very different about it than going to see the butcher or the baker, I imagine. But then the covenant also has this religious terms. And I loved one of your panelists expressing, the nature of the covenant with water, how water can do all these things for us, how we're born we grow as a fetus in water, and then we come out from that water, and water's all around us. Our bodies are 70% water. So I think that's what I was hinting at very broadly. I don't have a answer for that.
Let me give you another question from Sarah. Your portrayal of women were so rich. What allowed you to be able to do that?
Well, thank you for that comment. I'm not entirely sure. I think that in a way I'm at a disadvantage. I have 3 sons, no daughters. But on the other hand, I have some very strong women in my life, from my mother and grandmothers and my various aunts, my partner, my role models, people like you, Diane, to be quite honest, people like you and people like Oprah, who, Mark Twain said that the difference between people who don't read and who can't read is no difference at all. And I think people like you bring people to books, and, you walk the talk. And so it wasn't really hard to look around and, put myself in the shoes of the people I admired, and sometimes ask them point blank about what a woman would do in this situation. I had great help with some of my colleagues who are women and OBGYN physicians, who talked about labor from their point of view in terms of having given birth themselves and being clinicians. And so that was extraordinarily helpful. So that's how I did it.
Indeed. A question from Taddy, who says, some might think this book is too long. I thought it was too short. I never wanted it to end. I kept on wondering, how did all this come from the brain of one person? Maybe you can't answer that question.
Well, I mean, I hear a lot about the length of the book, and I think in publishing, there's always these paradigms waiting to be broken. My editor talks about receiving the manuscript of Shuggie Bain, which went on to be a Booker Prize winner, but
yes,
Shuggie Bain was rejected by 20 different publishers till Peter
know.
Blackstock picked it up. And now that's become a paradigm. That's, people say, well, this book is just like Shuggie Bain, trying to sell it, So I recognize that a long book can be off-putting, but in my experience as a reader, if I can get into a book by 10 to 15 pages, at that point, it not only doesn't matter how long the book is, but I hope it's long enough that it keeps me going for, a long time. I love that feeling of entering a fictional world, living through 3 or 4 generations, and you finally put the book down, and it's just Tuesday. It's like a time machine. You've stopped time. I don't know any other instrument that can stop time like a good epic novel. So those are the novels I love to read. And maybe for that reason, I really was ambitious to tell a story that had that kind of power, because there is a power in 3 generations. There is a wisdom if you can pull it off. And the question was, could I pull it off? And I tried my best.
When did you know the ending of the book?
Not till I was really well into it. So there was a certain point when I suddenly could see, because I had allowed Digby and Elsie to have this moment where, she helps him with his hand that's kind of frozen, but not from any physical problem, but more a mental frozenness. And it just seemed to me that had to come back, and I wasn't sure how. And in writing, in sitting at this very chair, at this very desk, at some moment I just saw it. And then once you see the ending, you're home free, because then you can sort of go back and, fix everything and make everything head to that climax.
Yeah.
So I don't see how anybody could see that ahead of time. It's, without knowing the characters, without really knowing them deeply, how do you manage to put two, talking heads into that kind of situation? So it had to be through the writing for me.
So for you, as you were writing and putting things up on that whiteboard next to you, somehow through what was happening in your writing and to these characters, are you saying that suddenly you saw that ending?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I might have seen other things that I thought were going to happen, but then I would start to write that, and I would just have sense that this is false, that it's not, it's not feeling right to me. And if it doesn't feel right to me, the odds are it won't feel right to the reader. Conversely, if I'm genuinely surprised by something that's going to happen, that I've just seen is going to happen, I don't mean surprise for the sake of surprise. I mean, just a surprise turn of events that feels true. If I'm surprised and it feels true, in general, I feel confident that the reader will also have the same reaction of being surprised, but also feeling like in the world of the story, that is what happened.
I think shock was something that occurred to me when Jojo died in that shallow puddle. Such a shock. And then when Philippos and Elsie's son, because of the tree that she had asked him to cut down, their son, that little boy, dies on what's left of that tree. That was truly a shocker to me, but I did not want that tree left there. I wanted it down completely right from the start, because I sensed that what was left of that tree was somehow going to bring on another tragedy.
Yeah. I think that it's amazing how some of our own stubbornness about trivial things, I mean, at one level, some of the major conflicts in the world come down to stubborn personalities and egos, and it's sad. All our omissions and our commissions have consequences, and many of these events, like the drowning of the young child, echoes a drowning of two little boys when I was growing up, children of school teachers who we knew. And one little boy fell into the pool, and his older brother, who must have been 5 or 6, jumped in to retrieve his brother. And it was the most tragic thing we didn't witness it, but we were at the funeral and so on. It was so indelible for me. And as an adult later in Ethiopia, the parents had left, but as a medical student, I would actually go to their graves from time to time, which were kind of neglected. And I think it was too painful for the parents to even stay in the country. And so that I think that drowning is a recurring, trauma in my life, a memory. And similarly with the tree, I mean, I've heard of some tragedy similar to that.
Really?
Nothing that I witnessed, but I heard of anecdotally. But then there is no end of, tragedies like this that exist, and it's just a matter of which one you draw on.
Here is a question about Lenin. I loved the book, didn't want it to end. I wanted to know if Mariama spoke to her mother and established a relationship with her. And of course, that's how the book ends, where the book ends. And also whether Lenin was released from prison and came back to Mariama. I know they would qualify as a happy ending, but can we believe both happened?
My answer isn't being coy, but it's really how I feel about these things. I think that, as I said, I think the reader owns the story that they've crafted in their mind. They own the visuals, they have their own conception of what these people look like. And so where I end is the invitation for the reader to, just take it in the direction that suits them. And many people will have very different ideas of what's going to happen. So I think it's a mistake for me to say more than that. I like the idea as a reader of being allowed to then carry this tale forward in any way I want or that suits me. And so as a writer, I want to give the reader that opportunity, because I don't know what's next.
One of the first blurbs on the cover of your book reads, "From the very first page, I was overtaken with joy." So I wonder there if you could talk about the relationship between tragedy and joy and how the two wend their ways together.
Yeah, I think I often think of I think it's Wallace Williams' poem. It had something to do about the rose and how a rose would not be a beautiful thing if it didn't, bloom, wither, and die. If roses never died, they would be like weeds, and we'd be doing our best to get rid of them. So I think all that is beautiful, all that is joyous in the world is so because it's ephemeral, because the nature of our lives is one where we clearly have a beginning and an end. And so our mortality is what lends everything poignancy. And I think by the same token, our awareness of the potential for tragedy, the potential for misfortune should make our day-to-day joys and happiness even more rich, because we're aware of the alternative. So the modern movement to think of all the things you're grateful for at the end of the day, and it's a very profound and rich thing to do, but it's trying to get us back into that mindset of recognizing all the things that didn't happen that day that could have been terrible, rather than and therefore express the gratitude for the ones that did happen.
As a very busy practicing physician and teacher, why did you turn to writing? Why did you need to turn to writing?
I had no desire to be a writer. I never set out to be a writer. To me, medicine has always been completely fulfilling, and to me, it's a romantic, passionate pursuit, which I still love. But I became a writer because of the extraordinary experience I lived through in a small town in Tennessee. After I had trained in infectious disease in Boston, in '85, I landed in Johnson City, Tennessee, population 50,000. And everyone said that I would not see any HIV there, or maybe one patient every other year. Instead, in a short time, I had about 100 people with HIV. And it turned out to be a small town paradigm of hometown boys who had left as part of the general exodus, went to the big cities for college, lived there, and then decades later, the virus had found them, and they were now coming back, often because their partners had died and they'd cared for them. Now they were sick. And I wrote a scientific paper describing this paradigm of migration, really an American story of migration. And even as I wrote the paper, which got a lot of recognition in science, I felt that the language of science didn't begin to capture the heartache of that journey, the tragic nature of it, the grief of the parents, or my own grief at taking care of young men who were my age at the time. And so I decided to try and write about it. And that was my first book, My Own Country, which was the tale of that HIV era. My Own Country, a doctor's story in the age of HIV.
And of course, Philippos becomes a writer.
Indeed, yeah. He does. Yeah, I think it's a reflex for writers to put writers as characters in their novels.
Philippos also goes through a terrible ordeal of drug use and drug addiction. Were you thinking about the problems we are having today?
Not so much. I mean, after My Own Country, my first book, my second book was called The Tennis Partner, and it was the story of a a medical student of mine who was a former tennis professional and my tennis buddy, who relapsed into severe intravenous cocaine addiction. And
Oh.
so that was my entry into the world of physicians and addiction, to visit centers where at any one time 100 physicians are being rehabilitated. And I really learned so much about addiction that I should have known. I mean, mind you, I was already taking care of addicts in the context of the hospital, but I came to a new visceral understanding of addiction as a real disease. And so I think I've always been interested, even before the current epidemic and interest. In fact, the tennis partner of that book is having a second life because of the fentanyl and opioid and, OxyContin epidemics. So I drew on that because it's something that I think about a lot and that I know. I should also say that one of your panelists pointed out that there were so many of my characters who were all good, so to speak, and no villains except for one, she said. And I think that, that represents most of us. None of us are perfect, and we're not necessarily good, but we're trying for redemption. We all make mistakes. I've made mistakes that I'm trying to redeem myself. And I think Philippos is an example of that. He's made a terrible mistake with his wife, with the tree, with his son. And so the rest of his life is about redemption, about trying to do the right thing.
But there is one other character in your book, the doctor that Digby meets initially at the Indian Medical Service. He seems like a truly evil character.
He does. And, that may be my failing, because if I had done a better job, maybe he would have a little more roundedness. I remember hearing about Lee Marvin, the famous actor who always played bad guys. And some reporter asked him, Mr. Marvin, how come you always play these bad guys? And he said, son, I've never played a bad guy in my life. Which is how you have to play it. You have, he plays a character who the world perceives as bad, but I don't think anybody sets out to be intrinsically evil. It's just the way things evolve,
But it also seemed to have something to do with the awful seniority system. I mean, Digby was a Scot, but the senior doctor was a Brit and felt he was all powerful.
Yeah.
And in between, the fact was he was a terrible doctor.
He was, yeah. Unfortunately, that still can happen. Medicine remains very hierarchical, and we're not spared that. I mean, in this country, every year, if we didn't have literally thousands of foreign medical graduates coming in, a lot of our inner city hospitals and residency programs would not be staffed. I mean, that is how I came in. So we have a very cost-effective way of providing good care in inner city hospitals through graduate medical education, because you can't hire licensed physicians to just come and work there in isolation. It's very harsh conditions. They can go elsewhere. And so, as a foreign physician arriving in America, there were only certain hospitals I could apply to.
Huh.
And it was only at the level of specialization or by really excelling that, I find it a bit incredible that I'm here at Stanford. I could not have shown my face here to be an intern. It just wasn't, So what I'm saying is that hierarchy is rampant in all societies. And we talk about caste in the book, but we have our own castes here in America. And the great awakening we had in COVID was a recognition of just how much privilege and caste affects our day-to-day lives,
Most of the deaths in this book are accidental or because of some error. But I personally am very involved in medical aid in dying. And I wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there are more accidental deaths than are the norm in terms of how most of us wind up dying. And I'm like you, very concerned about the end of life, very concerned about, the kind of, there's some striking graphs to show that we wind up spending the vast amount of our income and equity in the last few weeks of our lives for what turns out to be futile measures. And so I think this is clearly an area that we all have to be very thoughtful about and informed about what we want before we reach those situations. And it's tricky. It really is tricky. You know?
It's tricky because many physicians believe that they should be the ones to decide when a person dies. Do you believe an individual has that right to say, I've had enough, I cannot go longer?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would push back and say that what I see is quite the opposite. I think that, very often physicians are the first to recognize that this is sort of futile, but family members, for complicated reasons, want to go on when, it's unlikely that this will be reversed, So I think that the common prejudice is that physicians are the ones who are keeping everybody alive, but I don't think that's the case. At least what I see is very often, family members fly in at the last minute. They haven't been that involved. They come in with a mix of regret and guilt, and they channel that into, let's get everything done. And it takes a lot of courage to let go. And very often, and we have no ability to sort of say to them, no, we're going to not let this go on. We really try to arrive eventually at a place where everybody is in consensus, if it's completely futile,
And Dr. Verghese, are you hard at work on a new novel?
Not yet, I must say. I think I'm just relishing these kind of moments. They're very special. So I certainly don't want to rush off and start something else. I'm really celebrating is what I'm doing.
Well, I know that whatever you write, we will all be looking forward to and reading with great interest and joy.
Thank you so much. And it's been such a pleasure to talk to you again. You're one of the heroic figures that I consider the privilege I've had to know in my life. So thank you for reaching back to me to have me on your show. I'm so honored.
Dr. Verghese, the honor is mine. Thank you so very much for being with us today. Thank you. And our next book club meeting will be on Wednesday, September 27th. The book is Trust by Hernan Diaz, which shared this year's Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So keep an eye on your inbox for more information. And before you go, please do take a moment to fill out a short survey about this event. It will pop up on your screen. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Yanlan Zhang is our events manager. Ali Dickman is our events director. We couldn't do these events without the support of Leslie Van Sant, Kennedy Wright, Carly Cloud, Lauren Centrella, Narendra Silva, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thanks to all of them and to you as well. I hope to see you again next month. Until then, I'm Diane Rehm.